The battlefield stretched for miles, a scar of smoldering wreckage and lifeless husks of machines that once roared in defiance of one another. The air was thick with the acrid scent of plasma burns and scorched metal, mingling with something more visceral, the unmistakable iron tang of blood. High above, the sky was bruised with storm clouds as if nature itself mourned the dead. Sergeant Adam Vance stood among the ruins, rifle slack in his grip, boots caked in ash and mud. His armor, battle-worn and pitted from countless engagements, bore the scratches and dents of a man who had survived too many fights that should have killed him. He surveyed the aftermath with a practiced eye, calculating cold. A decade of war had stripped away any illusions of glory. There was only survival and the next fight. The war against the Tyrak Dominion had raged for years, a brutal conflict between the relentless expansion of a warrior empire and humanity's defiant resistance. The Tyrak were stronger, faster, and bred for combat. But humans? Humans were something else. They learned. They adapted. And when pushed to the brink, they did the impossible. The comlink on his wrist crackled to life. A voice sharp with urgency broke through the static. "Vance, you need to see this." He moved through the wreckage, weaving past the fallen. Some were his own. Some were Tyrak. In the end, the corpses didn't care whose side they had been on. They were equal in death. At the makeshift command post, Lieutenant Harper gestured towards a holo display flickering in the dim light. A live transmission. A towering figure stood at the center of the projection, clad in ornate battle armor that shimmered with dark metallic hues. General Var'Nak, Supreme Commander of the Tyrak forces. His reptilian features were chiseled from centuries of genetic refinement. 4 muscular arms crossed in rigid authority. His slitted eyes gleamed with cold amusement. "Humans," Var'Nak rumbled, his voice a serrated edge cutting through the static. "Your resilience is remarkable, but your victories are an illusion, propped up by cowardice and trickery." His gaze locked onto the camera as if looking directly through the screen and into their souls. "You refuse to meet us in true combat. You scurry like vermin, hiding behind machines and numbers. This is not war. This is disgrace." Harper's fingers tightened into fists. "Bastards taunting us." Vance said nothing, watching, listening. Var'Nak stepped forward, expression unreadable. "I propose a test, a duel. Man against warrior, flesh against flesh. Let us see if humanity has strength, or only desperation." Silence hung thick in the room. A duel. It was a trap, a ploy to shatter morale, to prove their dominance. Everyone knew it, and yet they also knew the truth. If no one accepted it, would be seen as an admission of weakness. The Tyrak would take it as proof that humanity was unworthy of the war it fought. The cost of refusal would be far greater than a single life. Harper exhaled slowly. "No one's going to be stupid enough to—" "I'll do it," Vance said. Head snapped toward him. Harper's eyes narrowed. "Like hell you will." Vance met her stare with the quiet certainty of a man who had already made peace with his fate. "We lose more men every day in battles we can't afford to fight. If this gets us leverage, it's worth it. Or it gets you killed for nothing." Vance shrugged. "Then I make it mean something." The comlink flickered again. The message had already spread across the sector. There was no turning back. General Var'Nak's mandibles curled in what might have been a grin. "Very well, human. The arena awaits." The dropship rattled as it descended through the thick, dust-choked atmosphere of Daskavar. The air was oppressive, a mixture of acrid ozone and burning wreckage, a constant reminder that this was no place for the weak. Sergeant Adam Vance adjusted the straps of his combat harness, fingers tightening momentarily before relaxing. He had accepted the challenge. Now there was no turning back. The duel was to take place in the grand arena of Corvallis, an ancient Tyrak battleground where only the strongest had ever fought. It was a coliseum of brutality, carved from obsidian rock, with jagged walls that bore the scars of centuries-old battles. High above, thousands of Tyrak warriors gathered, their guttural voices creating a deep, rumbling chant that made the very air vibrate. This was a moment of honor for them. For humanity, it was a gamble for survival. As the dropship's ramp lowered, Vance stepped onto the blackened stone, his boots heavy against the surface. The Tyrak warlords, adorned in ceremonial armor, watched from elevated platforms, their slitted eyes filled with curiosity and contempt. They expected him to fail. They expected another fragile human to break beneath the weight of their might. And then he appeared. General Var'Nak, the Tyrak warlord, was a behemoth of a creature, towering over Vance by at least third. His obsidian-plated armor glowed with energy, intricate patterns of battle scars crisscrossing his four powerful arms. The air around him felt heavier, charged with the weight of unshaken confidence. The arena fell into a hush as Var'Nak strode forward, his mandibles twitching in amusement. "You are smaller than I expected," he rumbled, his voice carrying through the open space. His slitted pupils narrowed, studying Vance like prey. "Do all humans rely on such frail bodies, or are you the best your species can offer?" Vance exhaled, his gaze unwavering. "Size doesn't win fights," he muttered. A ripple of laughter surged through the crowd, deep and guttural. The Tyrak warriors found the remark hilariously ignorant. To them, strength was measured in raw power, in limbs that could crush, in fangs that could tear through steel. But humans didn't fight like them. A Tyrak officiator stepped forward, lifting a massive war staff. "The duel is set. One warrior enters, one warrior leaves. The gods will decide who is worthy." The staff struck the ground. The fight began. Var'Nak moved first, and he was fast. Too fast. A blur of obsidian armor and sharp claws, the alien warlord lunged with terrifying speed, closing the distance in an instant. Vance barely had time to react, rolling to the side, as the ground where he had stood shattered beneath the force of a blow that could have liquefied his bones. The Tyrak roared in amusement. "Run, human. It will not save you." Vance didn't run. He calculated, analyzed. Every movement was a piece of data. Every strike a glimpse into Var'Nak's patterns. The general was powerful, but he fought with predictable arrogance. Each attack was meant to overwhelm, to break an enemy through sheer force. Humans didn't break that way. He pivoted, rolling under a massive sweeping strike, his combat knife flashing as he slashed through the exposed joint of one of Var'Nak's lower arms. A sharp hiss of pain. Dark blood spattered the stone. The arena fell silent. Var'Nak's mandibles flared. His eyes burned with fury. No one had ever wounded him in a duel before. Vance smirked, shaking out his shoulders. "Not so frail now, Em." The wound on Var'Nak's lower arm dripped thick black blood, sizzling as it hit the stone floor. The arena's silence lasted only a moment before it erupted into a cacophony of roars, some enraged, others shocked. The Tyrak warriors had expected an execution, not a fight. Var'Nak's mandibles twitched, his slitted eyes narrowing in fury. He had underestimated the human. That mistake would not be made again. He launched himself forward with renewed ferocity, a whirlwind of raw power and sharpened claws. Vance barely had time to dodge as four arms moved in tandem, each strike faster, more precise. A blade whistled past his ear, missing by inches, while another swipe carved a deep gash into his shoulder armor, sending sparks flying. Vance gritted his teeth. He couldn't keep dodging forever. His mind raced. Think. Adapt. Survive. The Tyrak were trained for brute strength, for domination, but they weren't used to opponents that didn't fight like them. Every duel they had fought had ended the same way. The weaker opponent crushed beneath their might. But Vance wasn't playing by their rules. He wasn't here to fight. He was here to win. Var'Nak lunged, aiming a bone-shattering punch at Vance's ribs. Instead of dodging, Vance twisted at the last second, using the general's own momentum against him. He grabbed the Tyrak's wounded lower arm, yanking it as he dropped to one knee. A sickening pop echoed across the arena. Var'Nak staggered, his lower limb hanging limp. The crowd gasped. Vance pressed his advantage. He rolled forward, reaching into his belt, pulling out a flash charge the size of his palm. He slammed it into the general's side, activating it just as he dove away. A blinding explosion of light and concussive force detonated against Var'Nak's torso, sending the alien general crashing to the ground. The air thickened with disbelief. No Tyrak had ever fallen in the arena before. The warlord growled, forcing himself up, his body trembling with rage. The ornamental plates of his armor were cracked, a jagged scorch mark running across his chest. His breaths were ragged, heavy. And yet, his mandibles twisted into a grin. "You are cunning, human," he rumbled. "But you forget one thing." His third arm, untouched, still strong, lashed out. A massive fist connected with Vance's gut, lifting him off the ground, the force sending him skidding across the stone floor. Air rushed from his lungs. Pain ignited across his body. He rolled, coughing, tasting copper in his mouth. The Tyrak warriors howled in approval. Var'Nak cracked his massive knuckles, stepping forward. "You fight well," he admitted. "But strength still decides the victor." Vance wiped blood from his lips, eyes flickering to the edges of the arena. "No, not strength, not here." Var'Nak was breathing heavily. He was injured, slower, and angry. Anger made people reckle. As Vance smirked, he still had one more trick up his sleeve. Var'Nak towered over Vance, his massive frame casting a shadow of sheer dominance. The general's mandibles twitched, his breath coming in deep, controlled huffs. He was hurt, but his confidence remained unshaken. The crowd sensed the shift. The anticipation thick in the air. Humanity's champion was slowing, weakening. This was the moment the Tyrak had been waiting for. Vance struggled to his feet, his ribs screaming in protest. Blood trickled down his temple, staining the side of his vision in red, but he barely noticed. Pain was just another obstacle. His fingers curled into fists, every nerve in his body calculating, waiting for the right moment. Var'Nak flexed his remaining 3 arms, rolling his shoulders. "You have proven yourself, human," he rumbled, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of unchallenged victories. "But this ends now." He charged, each step shaking the arena's foundation. Vance didn't move. Not yet. The instant before impact, he dropped low, pivoting on his heel. The general's fist swung just inches over his head, the sheer force of the missed punch sending a gust of air powerful enough to rattle the dust off the stone floor. Var'Nak stumbled forward from the unexpected maneuver, and that's when Vance struck. With all the power he had left, Vance drove his combat knife into the general's exposed side, right between the overlapping plates of armor. A roar of agony split the air. Var'Nak lurched backward, clutching his wound. The crowd fell into stunned silence, their warlord wounded for the second time, something unheard of in Tyrak dueling history. But Vance knew it wasn't over. Var'Nak was still standing, and he was done playing. The warlord's mandibles flared wide, his rage erupting in a deafening roar. With his remaining arms, he reached for his final weapon, a ceremonial Tyrak energy blade, its edge pulsating with unstable plasma. Vance's heartbeat slammed against his ribs. One clean strike from that blade, and it was over. Var'Nak lunged, again, this time with lethal precision. Vance dodged left, barely avoiding the blade as it carved into the stone floor, melting it on contact. The heat was scorching, but he had no time to react. Var'Nak was already swinging again. Vance rolled, barely escaping another near-fatal arc of the plasma blade. Too close, too fast. He couldn't outlast him, but maybe he didn't have to. His eyes flicked upward, to the weakened support beams of the arena's ceiling, still damaged from the earlier explosion. A desperate plan formed. Vance sprinted toward the nearest wall, forcing his burning legs to push off the stone. He leapt, gripping onto the jagged rocks above. The audience shouted in confusion. No warrior had ever fled in a duel before. Var'Nak snarled. "You cannot escape, human." Vance wasn't trying to escape. From his perch, he reached into his belt, pulling out his last explosive charge, a high-yield gravity mine, its surface pulsing red. He threw it. The mine hit the cracked ceiling above Var'Nak's head and detonated. A shockwave ripped through the arena, sending shards of heavy debris tumbling downward. Vance jumped as tons of rubble crashed down onto the Tyrak general, burying him under a collapsing wall of stone and steel. The arena shook violently, and then, silence. The crowd froze. Thousands of Tyrak warriors staring in disbelief. Dust settled over the battlefield, a thick fog of destruction obscuring the scene. Vance staggered to his feet, coughing through the debris. His entire body ached, but he forced himself to look toward the pile of rubble. No movement, no sound. The unthinkable had happened. Var'Nak, the unbeaten, the unstoppable warlord of the Tyrak Dominion, was defeated. For the first time in history, a human had won. Vance wiped blood from his chin, his voice hoarse but steady. Not about strength, General. It's about knowing when to end the fight. The arena erupted, not in rage, not in protest, but in something else entirely. Awe. The dust lingered in the air, swirling in slow, ghostly patterns, as if even the planet itself couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The grand arena of Corvallis, a sacred battleground where only the strongest had ever stood victorious, now bore the scars of its first human triumph. Vance stood amidst the wreckage, his breaths coming in slow, deliberate gulps. Every muscle ached, his body a patchwork of bruises, cuts, and exhaustion, but he was still standing, and that was what mattered. The Tyrak remained silent, thousands of warriors staring down at the battlefield, their expressions unreadable. Some clenched their fists, jaws tight with barely restrained fury, but others, more than Vance expected, watched with something else entirely: respect. A deep rumbling echoed through the arena. At first, Vance thought it was another tremor from the destruction he had caused, but then he realized it was laughter, slow, hoarse, pained, but unmistakably amused. The rubble shifted, stones and metal groaning under the weight of a wounded, but very much alive, General Var'Nak. The massive warlord emerged from the wreckage, his armor cracked, blood running freely from wounds that no Tyrak had ever suffered in this arena. One of his lower arms hung limp, his movement sluggish, but he was alive. Vance tensed, bracing for another fight. But Var'Nak didn't attack. Instead, the general raised one of his remaining arms, palm open, a universal signal, one that had been understood across countless battlefields. Surrender. The arena exploded with sound, thousands of Tyrak warriors reacting in a cacophony of roars, some in protest, others in astonishment. Their warlord had yielded, not in defeat, but in recognition. Var'Nak's gaze locked onto Vance's, his mandibles twitching in what might have been a grin. "You fight like no other," he rumbled, voice thick with pain but also something deeper. Genuine admiration. He slammed his fist against his chest plate, a gesture of honor among the Tyrak. Vance exhaled slowly, his grip loosening on his knife. He didn't return the gesture, not yet, but he gave a single, tired nod. That seemed to be enough. The Tyrak leadership, seated in their high platform, stirred. This was not what they had expected. Their greatest warrior had been challenged, wounded, and had acknowledged a human as his equal. That had never happened before. One of the warlords, an older Tyrak with deep crimson plating, stood. "This duel was meant to prove human inferiority," he growled, his eyes burning with fury. "And yet you let this thing live?" Var'Nak's gaze snapped toward him, his mandibles pulling back in a low, dangerous snarl. "He did not need to kill me," the general replied. "And still, he won." Silence fell again. The older warlord's claws tightened around the hilt of his ceremonial blade, but he did not draw it. He knew, they all knew, that Var'Nak's word carried weight, and the rest of the warriors, even those who despised humans, had seen the truth with their own eyes. Vance rolled his shoulders, forcing himself to stand taller, ignoring the ache in his bones. He didn't have diplomatic authority, but he knew, an opportunity when he saw one. "If this war is about strength," he said, his voice hoarse but firm, "then you've seen ours. You've felt it. You know now that we're not just some insect race to be crushed under your boots." He let the words sink in, watching as the warriors exchanged glances as some hesitated. Then he turned his gaze back to Var'Nak. "So tell me, General, is this war still worth fighting?" A long pause. The towering Tyrak inhaled deeply, considering. His eyes flicked to his injuries, to the warriors still watching, and finally back to Vance. "No," he said finally, voice gravelly, but certain. "It is not." The arena erupted. Some cheered. Others roared in protest, their voices filled with fury and denial. The Tyrak leadership was divided, and Vance knew this wasn't over. Not yet. But it was a beginning of something different. Maybe even peace. The war wasn't over. Not yet. Vance stood at the edge of the ruined arena, watching the divided Tyrak forces as they argued among themselves. Some demanded retribution, unwilling to accept that their warlord had yielded, while others, the younger, more pragmatic warriors, looked at Vance with something akin to curiosity, perhaps even admiration. Var'Nak, still injured but unbowed, leaned against the remains of a shattered pillar. His slitted eyes scanned the chaos before turning to Vance. "You know this changes nothing," he rumbled. Vance scoffed, rolling his stiff shoulder. "It changes everything." The general's mandibles twitched. Amusement? Perhaps. Or maybe something closer to agreement. A voice crackled through Vance's wristcom, barely cutting through the interference of the Tyrak capital's failing infrastructure. "Vance, extraction inbound. Command wants a full report. The signal cut out, but he'd heard enough. They wanted to know if peace was possible." Vance let his gaze sweep across the fractured battlefield, past the warlords who still burned for blood, and the warriors who were reassessing everything they thought they knew. The Tyrak had believed humanity to be weak, reliant on technology and cowardly tactics. And yet, he had stood alone. And won. The implications were staggering. If the Tyrak Dominion's greatest warrior had been challenged and bested, then the entire foundation of their war philosophy was crumbling. Their empire had stood for centuries on the idea that strength alone determined worth. And now, for the first time in their history, strength had taken a different form. Not brute power, but adaptability, intelligence, resilience. Var'Nak straightened despite his wounds. "There will be those who fight for war," Vance nodded, unblinking. "And those who will fight for something else." A long silence stretched between them before the Tyrak general exhaled deeply. "If I am challenged, I will fight again." Vance smirked, shaking his head. "So will I." Above, the distant hum of approaching dropships signaled the end of this battle, but not the war. Not yet. But as Vance turned toward the extraction zone, stepping over the ruins of the past, he knew one thing with certainty. The war wasn't over, but humanity had just changed the rules. And for the first time, the Tyrak knew fear.